Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Kunal Chattopadhyay, Professor of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. This is a course on reading new literatures in English, and the module is Science Fiction as a New Genre. I am the content writer. The learning objectives of this module include assisting the student into looking at how new genres are formed in popular literature, taking science fiction as a case study, elaborating alternative definitions which also involve generic classification. We will further attempt to look at a range of subgenres of science fiction, and while the main focus will be on English in the Anglo-American scene, given the translations that have been carried out and so on, we will also be looking at how the genre has worked out in different languages and cultures. When we look at definitions, one definition which has been put forward by Paul Kincaid, who follows Wittgenstein, is to propose that we can neither extract a unique common thread binding all texts of science fiction together, nor identify a unique common origin. While constructing generic definitions is a scholarly necessity, the moment we try to adopt a historical approach to genre, we find that fixing the genre tends to be undermined. Kincaid's argument is based on Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance. He suggests that science fiction is not one thing, rather it's any number of things: a future setting, a marvelous device, an ideal society, an alien creature, a twist in time, an interstellar journey, a satirical perspective, a particular approach to the matter of story. Whatever we are looking for when we look for science fiction, here more overt, there more subtle, which are braided together in an endless variety of combinations. A rather different and much more rigorous definition was attempted a long time back. In fact, this has been considered the classic academic definition by Darko Suvin, first in an essay in 1972 and eventually in his book The Metamorphosis of Science Fiction in 1979. He offered a precise concept of the genre ruled by what Roman Jakobson called a dominant. Jakobson argued that the focusing component of a work of art that rules, determines, and transforms the remaining components is what should be called a dominant. For Suvin, science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and whose main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. In presenting this definition, Suvin takes off from Ernst Bloch's concept of the novum. He postulates a spectrum or spread of literary subject matter which extends from the ideal extreme of exact recreation of the author's empirical environment to an exclusive interest in a strange newness. This whole range is what Bloch calls a novum. Suvin aims at a very restrictive use of the term science fiction. He wants to make a very sharp separation between what he sees as legitimate SF and other types or genres of fantastic fiction. He insisted on this separation on a linked literary and political ground, combining a borrowing of novum as a concept from Bloch and a stress on realism taken from Georg Lukács. His privileging of realism is profoundly reminiscent of Lukács' position in the celebrated Bloch-Lukács debate of 1938 in Das Wort, which was translated and republished in English in Aesthetics and Politics in 1980. Suvin saw his task as drawing a line firmly between progress and reaction. Like Lukács, he would take a sharp stance against what he called the abstract and one-dimensional fantasy with its ideology of escapism. His definition shifts science fiction to a different point of the novum because estrangement distinguishes it from the lived reality of the reader and the author. But cognition is supposed to differentiate science fiction from folklore, fairy tale, or fantasy, which he defines as ghost, horror, gothic, weird, and for which his example is, for example, H.P. Lovecraft. Cognition implies a creative approach tending toward a dynamic transformation rather than toward a static mirroring of the author's environment. However, Suvin then traces this typical science fiction methodology back to Lucian, Sir Thomas More, Cyrano de Bergerac, Swift, and on to H.G. Wells, Jack London, and others. Clearly, he is conflating all utopian literature with science fiction. A third definition was put forward by Raymond Williams, who distinguished it from utopia per se. He admits that there is a kinship between utopia and science fiction, but devotes a long essay published in the journal that Suvin had founded to drawing the distinctions between utopia and science fiction. Williams puts forward an understanding of science fiction where he suggests several points, of which one in particular is significant for us here, which is the role of technology in social transformation. If we move from theorists to practitioners, we shall see that the term emerged precisely at this point of the role of technology in social transformation. Hugo Gernsback, a minor author and an editor, used two terms. His initial term was scientifiction and the later one was science fiction. As he wrote, by scientifiction, I mean the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells and Edgar Allan Poe type of story, a charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. But his world was a narrow world. He was the editor of what in the United States used to be called pulp magazines, whose essential target readership was a male teenager. So there were some adventures, some unbelievable technology thrown in, and some rather gawky romance which constituted the core of this literature. When we move from people who have simply presented definitions to people who have attempted to write histories of science fiction, although some of the people who presented definitions like Suvin also attempted histories. But there have been historians like Brian Aldiss or others who have been mainly historians. We find that even if they sometimes pushed its prehistory back to ancient or medieval stories of utopia or the supernatural, all agreed that the first hard science fiction novel was a novel previously seen as Gothic. This was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Now, what makes Frankenstein a science fiction? Shelley herself argued, and I quote her, "The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin," she is referring to Erasmus Darwin, of course, and not Charles Darwin, "and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. I shall not be supposed as according to the remotest degree of serious faith to such an imagination. Yet, in assuming it as the basis of a work of fancy, I have not considered myself as merely weaving a series of supernatural terrors." In other words, she was consciously delinking the text from the Gothics of her day. The event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from the disadvantages of a mere tale of spectres or enchantment. It was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and however impossible as a physical fact, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. And its background was made possible by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution meant applied science regularly and systematically changing humans and their environment. While the optimists of the 19th century were seeing only a potential for growth and progress, putting forward a bright picture, there were others, including Mary Shelley, who were more cautious and critical. She rejected the view that science need not be concerned about its social consequences, or that science would by itself solve problems without reference to ethical issues. These were explicitly the issues raised by Frankenstein. This concern can be traced also through the writings of Verne or Wells. In Steam House, written in 1880 in French, Verne looks at colonial India a decade after the Great Revolt of 1857 and highlights some of the cruelties wrought by the rulers. Science, a detailed working out of technology, politics and ethics again come together in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and its sequel, The Mysterious Island. Wells, of course, was a socialist who stressed the role of education and who had a belief in superior types of people playing a crucial role in effecting a social transformation, as in When the Sleeper Wakes, an 1899 dystopia where hunger has disappeared from the world but monopoly capital dominates it. Wells is known for a large number of science fiction novels such as The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and The First Men in the Moon, along with When the Sleeper Wakes. These were all written between 1895 and 1901, although he would also write other texts. Between them, these two authors developed most of the staple themes of 20th century science fiction. Some authors would be seen as part of the genre only after theorists defined the genre in hindsight and historians started canon formation, such as Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann, more often simply known as E.T.A. Hoffmann, a major figure of the Romantic movement who played a role in examining the relationship between the new sciences and the older natural philosophy and showed considerable interest in the emerging machine culture. But figures who helped shape the as yet undefined genre were others. I would mention two. One was Edward Bellamy, whose looking backward with a hero Julian West falls asleep to wake up 113 years later. The story is set in 1887. West wakes up in 2000. He finds the United States transformed into a socialist utopia. Bellamy was deeply indebted to August Bebel, the German Marxist leader, for some of his arguments. A second important figure was Karel Čapek, whose text was originally written in Czech, but which profoundly influenced English language science fiction writing subsequently. While he wrote at least two important texts, it is the RUR, which stands for Rosumovi Univerzalni Roboti, or Rossum's Universal Robots, which took up some of the themes highlighted by Shelley. Čapek described the robots as organic beings who could be mistaken for humans. But in 1920, when he wrote the RUR, knowledge of DNA and generally genetics were still in their infancy, so his robots, though organic, are assembled in a factory. The impact of World War I as well as Fordism are perceptible here. Robot in Czech means worker and is derived from the Old Slavonic rabota, which means servitude. So, he is emphasizing work under coercion. There is a writer who in many ways can be considered much more minor, problematic, but whose writings would influence subsequent generations. This is Edgar Rice Burroughs. His John Carter transported thrilling adventures to a new planet. Now, we could say that John Carter was doing in Mars what heroes of other novelists were doing in Africa or the Wild West. But in shifting to Mars, Burroughs was opening up the possibilities for imitators. Barsoom, which is his name for Mars, is implausible, and Carter travels there by magic rather than hard science. It's also marked by race and gender overtones, marking the author and his immediate intended readership. But by placing the action in Mars, Burroughs starts a process where the ecology of the planet becomes an integral part of the tale. Even though his own handling is terrible. For example, Barsoom is an aging planet whose seas are drying up, which has water scarcity. Water supply via canals is controlled by often warring city-states, but he has all manner of carnivores without realizing that each carnivore needs a much larger supply of herbivores, and they in turn need greens, which would require more water. Now, these are problems, but the shift to Mars, the very fact of a new ecology, is something that Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke and others would be influenced by. Science-based imagination, social criticism, stories based on technological progress and sheer adventure, these were the four elements introduced and nurtured by the writers we have discussed so far. It's at this point that we come back to Hugo Gernsback, who founded a journal, Amazing Stories. In 1930, having seen the success of Gernsback's magazines, a new magazine came up named Astounding Stories of Super Science. Generally, it was simply called The Astounding. In 1933, a reasonably big publishing house, Street and Smith, acquired it. It would be edited first by a man named Tremaine, who had some influence, and then from 1937 by a man named John W. Campbell, who was tremendously influential. One of the earliest authors to write in a new way, providing more sophisticated and sensitive approaches, was Stanley Weinbaum. His A Martian Odyssey was to show an alternative to the Burroughs type of portrayal of Mars. But it was Campbell and the authors he developed who transformed science fiction. These authors included some of the greatest names in American science fiction like Robert A. Heinlein, A.E. Van Vogt, Isaac Asimov, Theodore Sturgeon, and Lester Del Rey. In fact, hard science fiction of the kind that became core to science fiction for a long time was created by a partnership of Campbell and Heinlein to start with. In 1939, Heinlein published his first short story, Lifeline. He would develop a whole structure called future history. Campbell's insistence that the science of the science fiction must sit well aesthetically was a crucial development. In the hands of Heinlein, science and technology came to be described through the eyes of beings who lived in the age being narrated, rather than appearing in undigested lumps of lectures on science in the way that you often find in H.G. Wells. Heinlein also accepted Campbell's stress on individualism and the supremacy of free market capitalism, and in Starship Troopers, he sharply challenged left-wing anti-nuclear sentiments in the name of patriotism and civic duty. Many of his stories, such as Gulf, published in 1949, If This Goes On, serialized in 1940, expanded in 1953, and Stranger in a Strange Land, published in 1961, depends strongly on the premise related to the well-known Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that by using a correctly designed language, one can change or improve oneself mentally or even realize untapped potential. Isaac Asimov was a very different kind of writer. He would develop the 3 laws of robotics in his story collections I, Robot and the Rest of the Robots, often implicitly accepted also by other writers. These so-called laws allowed the writing of robot stories without the fear that Shelley and particularly Čapek had stoked. What robots were, what they could and could not do was ethically decided and turned into a core component of their manufacture. The 3 laws were built into what Asimov called their positronic brains. Later, Asimov would also explore the question of human ethics and ecology in Robots and Empire, Foundation's Edge, and Foundation and Earth. In his youth, Asimov had connections with the communist and Trotskyist connected science fiction writers group, the Futurians. The original Foundation novels retain that left imprint, though later Asimov took pains to distance himself from the left ideology. But the Campbell model of individualism, capitalism and racial supremacy of whites was challenged much more openly by 2 other Futurians, Fred Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth, in The Space Merchants, published in 1952. It shows a world dominated by monopoly capital being challenged not by one heroic individual but by groups cooperating. Those who do the challenging, however, appear more as Greens than as communists, even if Trotsky's name is dropped at one stage. The Konzis, that is, conservationists, are seditious enemies. Remember, this came out around the time of McCarthyism, and they are challenging corporate destruction of the ecology. In England, science fiction had a very different trajectory, being associated with Wells, Olaf Stapledon and others, and hence never treated as just pulp fiction. The most influential and grim science fiction dystopia would be written by a disillusioned leftist, George Orwell, in 1949. Titled 1984, this drew on James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution to suggest that bureaucratic elites were coming to dominate in all parts of the world. But it also drew on Trotsky, the history of the Soviet Union, as well as the British Labour tradition, because the alcohol and sleaze in which the proles are immersed was not really a part of the Soviet Stalinist tradition as it was for English working class. Significantly, accepting that 1984 was a legitimate part of the science fiction canon would take a lot of time. The sentiment appeared to be, if it is good literature, it cannot be called science fiction. So with this, we need to look at the question of canon formation and its connection with the genre. A point that we need to understand is that once upon a time, it used to be thought that genres are rigidly defined and once formed are there for good. What we increasingly realize is that genres are actually constantly reformulated. Souvin's attempt to pin the label progressive on science fiction is an attempt to rigidly link a political term with a literary one. So, the problem of understanding science fiction as a genre cannot be taken separately from the issue of canon formation. One point that we need to understand is that most schools of critical reading tend to privilege one particular genre. For example, when Lukács looks at realism, he has in mind primarily the novel. It's very clear if one looks at the differences between Lukács and Brecht, because Brecht is looking at theatre, Lukács is looking at novels. Now, Canon Formation was done in part by publishers. Some publishers might separate hard science fiction from the rest. For example, Astounding was very clear that it was publishing science fiction the way Campbell was defining it. When Damon Knight went on to launch his book series, he would do the same. But there would also be publishers or major booksellers who would lump science fiction together with fantasy, myth and related material. So Canon Formation would remain in the hands of people who were using extra literary considerations. Now, at the same time, literature itself is a conventional term and its generic categories change. A few generations back, the autobiography as a text was not considered serious or good literature worth teaching, writing critical essays, putting into syllabi. Now that has not only changed, but there have been further ramifications. For example, feminist scholars have argued that women's autobiographies are one particular form where women had a greater agency and therefore they need to be studied more seriously, and so on and so forth. And the same has happened to science fiction over the last half century. So if the birth of the science fiction novel can be dated to 1818 when Frankenstein was published, its transformation into a genre can perhaps be dated to the 1970s when you have. So this presupposes that till fairly recently, powerful forces in the literary field did not wish science fiction to function with the social prestige that literature in the strong sense enjoys. We all know the distinctions which even in some bookstores you would get, where you have sections called mystery, science fiction, and then one section where the hoarding says literature, assuming that mysteries, historical novels, romances, science fiction, these are not literature. Now, this is not primarily because of unfavorable judgments on individual texts, but because of a wholesale rejection of the genre. From this, we need to move on to a consideration of style and the issue of historicity. In Philip K. Dick's novels, the issue of feeling and how feeling can change over time comes up. Do we assume that feelings are something that we as humans have, our ancestors had, and the future will have in the same way? Dick seems to suggest no. For example, in the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, published in 1968, Dick invites the reader to consider the possibility that in a future age, emotions can move in a different way compared to what we today experience. Fairly early in this novel, a character is feeling irritated, and then comes this a clause in the sentence, though he had not dialed for it. In other words, irritation is a feeling which you can evoke by dialing for it, presumably other feelings as well. Now, Dick's writing quality is not what is normatively considered stylistic or quote-unquote good writing. One can think of Le Guin or Delany or Atwood as science fiction writers who would be considered stylists in mainstream fiction. But the key point one is making here is science fiction calls very often for styles that are quite distinct. You are describing a future. You are describing a world where humans and aliens interact, or where humans and machines interact in ways which is not known in your world. How can you not use language which is distinctive? This is something which a training in formalism allows one to understand. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or in Ubik, published in 1969, we do have Dick using these, and these novels can be analyzed using Bakhtin's terms. Dick's language use in these novels is radically dialogic. He exploits what Bakhtin calls heteroglossia, or the existence of linguistic polyvalency. And the way form and content are constantly brought together in Dick's novels remind us of Bakhtin's stress on the impossibility of delinking style from its social context and the linking of linguistic turns with more general movements of culture and society. In Ubik, for example, the science fictionness or the alien nature of the world described in the novel is brought alive by a series of references. For example, the solar system is introduced as a functioning economic unit. Psi power is quantified. And you consequently have a situation where, while you seem to be seeing a corporate capitalist society with which in many ways you are familiar, it's also estranged. At the same time, certain constraints are de-estranged by imposing measurability on them. For example, the very notion of quantifying psi power seems to make it less alien. If you can measure it, then it's scientific, isn't it? That's the whole notion. When we are looking at genres and subgenres of science fiction, one of the key shifts that we can consider is the move from the historical novel to science fiction. Because the main current of science fiction is a variant of historical fiction, or it could be said that science fiction steps in where old historical fiction declines. Lukács, who had studied the historical novel at length, argued that the French Revolution and Napoleon made history a mass experience and thereby made the historical novel the most vital literary form of the era. Leaving to one side his arguments about why it declined, we can suggest that in the 20th century and in the early 21st, among the popular genres that came up, SF alone presented an alternative because it showed itself repeatedly as alternative history or future history. Historically, Western liberal ideas of progress have cheerfully encompassed colonialism, all to uplift the benighted colonized. Responses come through subgenres that turn the gaze. Though the main current of science fiction was for long hard SF, if you look at Kim Stanley Robinson, for example, he challenges this. Hard science fiction is characterized by rigorous attention to accurate detail in the natural sciences, initially in physics, chemistry and astronomy, and in recent years also in biology and ecology. Among practicing scientists who have written hard science fiction, we can mention Fred Hoyle, Gregory Benford or David Brin. Other notable hard science fiction writers include Asimov and Clarke, Larry Niven, Greg Bear, Alastair Reynolds, Kim Stanley Robinson and Anne McCaffrey. But it's when we come to McCaffrey that we also find that fantasy and science fiction may have less than a Chinese wall. McCaffrey's famous Dragon Riders of Pern series displays less than rigid boundaries between fantasy and science fiction. The first novel, Dragonflight, was actually cobbled together out of two novellas which she stitched with an in-between story. For some of these, she actually won the Nebula Award. Now, in Dragonflight, telepathy and teleportation are described as power, a term more reminiscent of magic than science. In the Dragon Quest, we have some very early and rudimentary scientific discoveries coming in. But it's only with Dragon's Dawn in 1988 that she posits a scientific origin of the fire-breathing dragons of Pern. And then in novels like All the Wares of Pern in 1991 and The Skies of Pern in 2001, a strictly scientific account was constructed with errors that had previously crept in tidied up. The acknowledgement sections in the novels are interesting, showing the close collaboration the author had in the later novels with a range of scientists, whether biologists or astronomers or others. The other kind of science fiction novel has been called, in counterposition to hard science fiction, soft science fiction or social science fiction. This includes more extensive focus on psychology, politics, sociology, anthropology and economics. Philip K. Dick straddles the two worlds in his novels. But it's with the coming of feminist writers that we find a major shift. For example, in Le Guin's The Dispossessed, we find a dealing with utopia. In this novel, we find that utopia is not the end of history but the creation of new social complexities. Somebody can be unhappy even with utopia and might try to go to the parent world from which the utopians had seceded. On the other hand, The Left Hand of Darkness, a somewhat earlier novel of Le Guin, was an extraordinary text because it dealt with the question of gender and sexuality in a central way. We are told that the planet Gethen has inhabitants who are very humanoid, but they do not have sexual organs present all the time. These appear periodically, and when these appear, at times the same person can be male, at other times that same person can be female. The Earth human ambassador Genli I and the Gethenites find mutual exchange extremely difficult because Earth humans identify people strongly in gendered terms. For us, Le Guin is suggesting your primary role is always seen in terms of whether you're a male or you're a female. It's not your work role or other roles which are primary. By contrast, Gethenites, since they do not have the sexual organ and since they can become male or female at different points of their lives, do not identify anybody in sexual terms, excepting in those brief periods which they call being in Kemer. And therefore, these are awkward with humans, Earth humans, because they say that the Earth humans are always in Kemer. It's in the process of overcoming these difficulties that Genli I comes to recognize the humanness as opposed to the maleness or femaleness. This is, we need to remember that it's from 1967-68 that you have texts like Kate Millett and others coming up attacking patriarchy in literature, and here you have a literary attempt at redefining the terms. Le Guin and McCaffrey also start the connection between fantasy and science fiction in literary terms rather than through publishers' selling motivations. Le Guin's Earthsea novels also deal with dragons and fantasy elements. These would continue with China Miéville's novels, notably his Baslag novels, where you have a melding of science fiction and fantasy. We need to quickly look at a few other subgenres. One popular subgenre is cyberpunk, which uses advances in information technology and computers and film noir techniques. One classic example of cyberpunk is the 1982 film Blade Runner. Another subgenre which has become extremely popular in recent times, although it developed from the late Cold War period, is military science fiction. Much of military science fiction has a clear orientation in favor of imperial powers. Major writers include S.M. Stirling, David Drake, David Weber, and Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven. Pournelle's writings in particular have been quite influential. Pournelle and a few other writers were also advisors to Ronald Reagan for what was called the Star Wars program, the escalation of the another subgenre, which is being identified as a subgenre with its own sub-subgenres in recent times, is the group of or clusters of novels that we can call environmental science fictions. These stretch over a long period. You can think of Isaac Asimov's The Caves of Steel, which he published in 1954, to John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar, published in 1968, Brunner's later novel The Sheep Look Up, which is far more damning, published in 1972, to 21st century novels like Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, published in 2009, and Dale Pendel's The Great Bay Chronicles of the Collapse. Now, while Anglo-American science fiction has been dominant, other areas have also produced science fiction in different ways. One genre requiring some treatment would be Afrofuturism and black science fiction. Apart from that, we need to talk briefly about science fiction in other countries. Maybe Russian science fiction, a brief reference to a few Indian science fiction texts, and at least one East European science fiction writer of repute. Russian political science fiction goes back at least to the Bolshevik theorist Alexander Bogdanov, who wrote Red Star in 1908 and its prequel Engineer Many in 1913 to depict a communist society in Mars and how it came about. By the way, in Red Star, there are tongue-in-the-cheek references to Lenin and Plekhanov because Bogdanov was in quarrel with both of them at that time. Bogdanov would later be influential in the first years of the Soviet Union as an inspirer of a radical cultural trend known as the prolet cult, and science fiction would be quite popular among Russian avant-garde writers. In the USSR, science fiction was inspired by the scientific revolution, industrialization, and the mass education that called for mass literary production. But we have one very distinctive text, Evgeny Zamyatin's We, written in 1924, which was a critique of industrial society, which he saw as leading to dictatorial collectivism, and which has been seen as one of the influences on Orwell's 1984. Another author who was to also produce critical science fiction was Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote Heart of a Dog in 1925 and Ivan Vasilievich in 1936. By contrast, Alexei Tolstoy wrote hard science fiction, working out class struggle along the way. Post-Stalin Soviet science fiction had a greater leeway, but a major difference from much of Western science fiction was an assumption of a possible peaceful future world. Ivan Yefremov, the brothers Boris and Arkady Strugatsky are among the noteworthy writers. The Strugatskys wrote several novels dealing with a utopian future Earth, sending agents to other planets for social change who, however, fail. One does not know whether this was a tongue-in-the-cheek critique of Soviet attempts at influencing social transformation in what used to be called the Third World. But it's quite possible. Science fiction was also well developed in Soviet cinema with figures like Andrei Tarkovsky and Vladimir Tarasov. One outstanding East European science fiction writer who requires special mention is Stanisław Lem. His early novels were written under what he later said was compulsory socialist realism to placate the censors. De-Stalinization resulted in a sharp rise in his output. 17 books were published between 1956 and 1968, including several widely acclaimed science fiction books, both novels and collections of stories. Solaris, published in 1961, has been considered his greatest work. The planet Solaris is apparently uninhabited except for the scientists from Earth who operate a small research station. The surface of the planet is covered by water, and the visitors marvel at the range of patterns and forms taken by the waves, which act in an awe-inspiring and sometimes frightening manner. But cryptic events start taking place among the researchers, and the only possible explanation is that the ocean is responsible. Can a geographic fact, a part of the landscape, really be a life form? Lem deals with the fact that human intelligence can only try to understand the reality around it in its own terms, and that can lead to major limitations. I would now turn briefly to writings in Bengal, though they comprise both Bengali and English writings. In 1835, Kailash Chandra Datta, a young student of Hindu College, Calcutta, published in the Calcutta Literary Gazette a journal of 48 hours in the year 1945, dealing with an imaginary revolution against British rule and its eventual failure. Indian historians have read it as a proto-nationalist article. Now, this is a legitimate way of reading it, but by the terms we have been using, this can also be seen as the first Indian science fiction avant la lettre. Another major English science fiction novel which would be written, once again not treated as a science fiction novel till very recently, was Rokia Sakaba Hussein's Sultana's Dream, a very powerful early feminist text. In Bangla, science fiction was written but not presented as science fiction for a long time. Premendra Mitra's Tales of Ghanada, the resident of a Calcutta mess, as it used to be called. These were buildings in which several people rented an individual room and lived under one manager who organized the cooking and so on. Ghanada is a senior resident who spins tall yarns, and a number of his stories certainly qualify as science fiction. Noted author and humorist Sukumar Roy wrote Heshoram Hushiarer Diary, which can be seen as a spoof on colonial discovery narratives. But it was Sukumar Roy's son, noted filmmaker and author Satyajit Roy, who wrote a series of stories with a character called Professor Shonku. While extremely popular among Bangla readers and even translated into other languages, Shonku has poor science and little social setting. He is an inventor who invents everything from spaceships to robots to the annihilin ray in his one-man laboratory. Far more important for the development of a science fiction readership in Bangla where Manobendra Bandyopadhyay, who translated a vast number of science fiction novels from Verne to Lem, and Odrish Bardhan, who edited at different times Ashcharya and Fantastic, two science fiction periodicals. I would now, at the end, like to turn to Afrofuturism. This was a term coined by Mark Derry in his article Black to the Future in 1993. Afrofuturism imagines futures for those groups that stem from the cultural experiences of the African diaspora, though the definition should therefore also include Brazilian and other non-Anglophone people of color. In science fiction, the major figures who are considered tend to be all Anglophone. Samuel R. Delany has been seen as the first of these writers. But Afrofuturism has been traced back to the 19th century. Much like their white counterparts, 19th century Afrofuturists wrote in a diverse range of fantastic and proto-science fictional forms. The rise of pulp SF, with its dictum on white superiority, meant that race issues could not be easily taken up. New alliances between Afrofuturists and science fiction began in the 1960s, the decade there was a huge civil rights movement and a variety of social radicalism across the United States. Pioneering black authors such as Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, Charles Saunders, and Joel Gomez wrote science fiction. But it's possible to go back to the 1930s and look at George S. Schuyler's Black International, serialized between 1936 and 38, portraying a race war where blacks fight back and defeat the white oppressors in the US and liberate Africa as well. Delany's Dhalgrain, Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy collected together as Lilith's Brood, and Sherry R. Thomas edited Dark Matter, a century of speculative fiction from the African diaspora, are some of the defining texts of Afrofuturism.